All right, let's dive right into the fascinating world of weapons tech. You guys sent in some incredible excerpts from a documentary, and it looks like we're zeroing in on tanks, grenades, and machine guns.
Should be an explosive deep dive.
I see what you did there. But really, get ready for a wild ride through history, because we're going to uncover how human ingenuity has shaped these tools of warfare.
It really is amazing to see how these weapons evolved over time, and often in some pretty surprising ways. For instance, did you know the machine gun was initially marketed as a way to speed up, wait for it, tree cutting?
You're kidding, right?
Nope, dead serious.
No.
Apparently, even back then, marketing departments had a knack for putting a positive spin on things.
Well, it's hard to imagine a lumberjack wielding a Maxim gun to clear a forest. But I guess it speaks to the power and efficiency of the invention. But okay, let's rewind the clock a bit. Let's go back to the late 19th century, a time of rapid technological change when armies were desperately seeking ways to deliver firepower more efficiently, which, unfortunately, is often a driving force behind innovation in warfare.
Exactly. And that's where Hiram Maxim, this brilliant American engineer, enters the picture. He absolutely revolutionized warfare with his invention of the Maxim gun. And get this, the story goes that he was inspired by a rather cynical friend. This friend, observing the rising tensions in Europe at the time, suggested that Maxim invent something to help Europeans kill each other more quickly.
Wow. Dark humor aside, Maxim's invention was truly groundbreaking. It really did change the face of warfare.
Can you break down the mechanics of the Maxim gun for us? What made it so revolutionary?
Absolutely. The genius of the Maxim gun was its use of recoil. So basically, the force generated by each shot was cleverly harnessed to automatically reload the weapon. This eliminated the need for manual reloading and allowed for a sustained rate of fire that was, well, previously unheard of.
So instead of firing single shots, you could just unleash a continuous stream of bullets. No wonder it was so revolutionary. I have to ask about this tree cutting demonstration. Is that a real thing? Did Maxim actually use his gun to cut down a tree? He did. It was a publicity stunt, really, a way to showcase the power and efficiency of his invention. But of course, the real impact of the Maxim gun was felt on the battlefield, and that impact was, sadly, devastating.
It's hard to imagine the sheer terror of facing a weapon that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. It must have completely transformed the way wars were fought.
It absolutely did. The Maxim gun played a major role in the stalemate of trench warfare during World War I. Soldiers were huddled in trenches, facing these relentless barrages of bullets. The psychological and physical toll was unimaginable.
And speaking of the brutal realities of trench warfare, that brings us to another weapon that defined World War I, the grenade. It's crazy to think that something as seemingly simple as a grenade has such ancient roots.
Right. It's fascinating, isn't it? The grenade's etymology actually goes all the way back to the pomegranate fruit. Hard to believe, but it's true.
Now that's a connection I never would have made. What's the link between pomegranates and, well, explosions?
It's all about the looks. Early grenades were crude spheres filled with gunpowder and shrapnel, kind of like a round, seed-filled pomegranate. And the term grenade itself comes from the French word for pomegranate.
So we've got a fruit inspiring a weapon of war. Who knew? But tell me, how did those early grenades actually work? Were they effective?
Well, picture this. A hollow clay pot packed with gunpowder and bits of metal. A fuse was lit and the grenade was hurled toward the enemy, hopefully.
That sounds incredibly dangerous for both sides. What happened if the fuse burned too quickly?
Premature detonation was a very real risk. And if the grenade was accidentally dropped, well, things could go wrong very quickly. It was a weapon that demanded careful handling, to say the least.
And I'm guessing rain wasn't a grenade's best friend.
Definitely not. Water and gunpowder don't mix well. But then, during the American Civil War, a new type of grenade emerged that eliminated the need for manual ignition. This one had a plunger that detonated the grenade upon impact.
That sounds like an improvement, at least in terms of reliability. But what if the grenade landed on its side? Would it still explode?
That was the problem. It might not explode right away, giving the enemy a chance to, well, throw it back.
Talk about a high-stakes game of hot potato. So how did they solve that problem? When did grenades become more reliable?
The Mills bomb, the grenade that really came to define World War I, addressed these flaws with some really clever design features. It had a spin-loaded firing pin and a 7-second delay, making it much safer and more reliable. And unfortunately, much more effective.
And far more terrifying for those on the receiving end. I can't imagine what it must have been like to be trapped in a trench, knowing that at any moment a grenade could come flying in.
The psychological impact was immense. The Mills bomb brought a whole new level of terror to the trenches. Its explosions caused horrific injuries, and the constant threat of death took a heavy toll on the mental well-being of the soldiers.
It's a stark reminder of how advances in weapons technology often outpace our ability to treat the injuries they inflict. And that leads us to another technological marvel that emerged during World War I, the tank. Believe it or not, this weapon, which would come to dominate battlefields, was initially inspired by tractors.
Yeah, it's funny how some of the deadliest weapons were inspired by the most mundane things. The concept of a heavily armored mobile vehicle capable of crossing difficult terrain actually came from the humble tractor.
I guess when you think about it, the basic idea is there. A powerful engine, tracks for navigating rough ground. But I'm guessing those early tanks were a far cry from the sleek, powerful machines we see today.
Oh, absolutely. The first tanks, like the British Mark I, were slow, unreliable, and prone to mechanical failures. They could barely manage a walking pace, and their gasoline engines were these smoky, fume-belching beasts, creating a pretty awful environment for the crew inside. One veteran even described the T-34, a later model, as a hot, cramped, noisy oven.
Not exactly a comfortable ride. But despite their limitations, those early tanks must have had a profound psychological impact on the battlefield. What was it like for soldiers to face these things for the first time?
Oh, you can imagine the terror enemy soldiers seeing these lumbering behemoths for the first time. The sheer size and noise, coupled with their apparent invulnerability, it must have been terrifying, like facing some kind of mechanical monster.
It must have felt like something out of a nightmare. But I imagine the initial shock wore off as the limitations of those early tanks became apparent. They weren't exactly invincible, were they?
Right, their armor wasn't impervious to artillery fire, and their slow speed made them vulnerable to counterattacks. Tank warfare quickly became a game of adaptation and innovation, each side trying to outmaneuver and outgun the other.
So how did tank design evolve to overcome these challenges? What were some of the key advancements that led to the tanks we see today?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. From the lumbering Mark I, we see the emergence of faster, more heavily armed tanks like the iconic Soviet T-34 and the formidable German Tiger tank, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
This is fascinating. We've gone from the rapid fire of the Maxim gun to the terrifying power of grenades, and now we're exploring the evolution of tanks from humble tractors to formidable war machines. And we're just getting started.
Buckle up, because next we'll be delving into the era of massive bombs and the escalation of destructive power. Things are about to get really, really big.
Stay with us. So we've been exploring this evolution of weapons from machine guns to grenades to tanks, and now we're moving into the realm of truly massive destructive power, the kind of bombs that can level entire city blocks. It's almost hard to even fathom the scale of destruction we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame when you start talking about these massive bombs. We're not talking about taking out a trench or a tank. We're talking about wiping out entire areas.
And you mentioned one of these bombs in our notes called the mother of all bombs. Tell me more about that. What makes it so special?
The MOAB. It's officially called the GBU-43B Massive Ordnance Air Blast, but MOAB is a lot easier to say, and it definitely lives up to its nickname. This thing is a 30-foot-long behemoth with an explosive yield equivalent to 11 tons of TNT.
11 tons of TNT.
Yeah.
That's insane. What's the thinking behind a bomb that powerful? Is it about precision targeting, or is it more about just obliterating everything in a massive area?
It's definitely more about creating a massive blast wave and fireball capable of just obliterating everything within a 500-foot radius. It was actually developed back in 2002, but wasn't actually used in combat until 2017 during the Trump administration.
And where was it used?
It was deployed in Afghanistan against a complex of tunnels and caves used by ISIS fighters, and according to reports, the blast destroyed all buildings within that 500-foot radius. So, yeah, pretty devastating.
It's just hard to wrap your head around that kind of power.
Yeah.
What was the strategic thinking behind using such a massive weapon?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about the military advantage of the MOA. Some experts argue that it's more about sending a message projecting an image of overwhelming force rather than achieving a specific tactical objective.
So kind of a show of force then.
Yeah.
But of course, when it comes to shows of force, we can't forget about Russia. They have their own father of all bombs, right?
Oh, yeah. They're not going to be outdone by the U.S. Russia introduced its aviation thermobaric bomb of increased power, nicknamed the father of all bombs, back in 2007. It's basically their answer to the MOA.
And how does this father of all bombs stack up against the American MOA? Is it just a bigger bomb, or is there something more to it?
Well, the Russian bomb is reportedly 4 times more powerful than the MOA, with an explosive yield equivalent to 44 tons of TNT. And it's not just about the size of the blast. This is a thermobaric weapon. also known as a vacuum bomb.
Vacuum bomb. That sounds terrifying.
Hmm.
How do those work? What makes them different from conventional bombs?
So it's a two-stage detonation process. First, the bomb disperses a cloud of fuel and then ignites it, creating this massive fireball and a powerful shockwave. But what makes a vacuum bomb particularly devastating is the way it consumes oxygen from the surrounding air, creating a vacuum.
So if you're caught within the blast radius,
It's not just the heat and the blast. The sudden drop in air pressure can rupture internal organs, causing death, even if you're not directly hit by the explosion.
that's intense. So these bombs are a whole other level of destructive power. And it makes you wonder, what's the point? What's the strategic value of having weapons this powerful?
Well, like the MOAB, there's a lot of debate about the practical military application of the father of all bombs. Some see it as more of a display of power, a way for nations to flex their military muscles on the world stage.
So it's more about propaganda and intimidation than actual battlefield effectiveness.
Hmm.
A terrifying game of one-upmanship.
That's one way to look at it. The development of these weapons highlights this really complex interplay of political and strategic considerations in the world of military technology. It's not always about what's most effective on the battlefield, but also about projecting an image of strength and deterrence.
It's a sobering thought. We've gone from relatively simple weapons like grenades and early tanks to bombs that can obliterate entire city blocks. And with technology constantly advancing, who knows what the future holds?
That's the big question, isn't it? What will the next generation of weapons look like? And how will these advancements shape the future of warfare? It's something to think about.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the ingenuity of the Maxim gun to the devastating power of massive bombs. It's been a journey through the horror and the complex realities of weapons technology. But the conversation doesn't end there. We'll be right back to wrap up this deep dive and explore some of the larger implications of what we've learned. It's amazing to think about everything we've discussed in this deep dive, from that rapid fire of the Maxim gun to the terrifying power of grenades, and then those tanks evolving from, well, tractors to these incredibly formidable war machines. And of course, we can't forget those massive bombs with nicknames that, it's like they belong in a superhero movie. It's really been a journey through, the ingenuity, the horror, and just the really complex realities of weapons technology.
Yeah, and it makes you think about how human innovation, can be applied in such drastically different ways. On one hand, you have these incredible advancements in medicine and technology that are improving lives. But then on the other hand, we see this same creativity used to develop these tools for destruction, these tools that have shaped the course of history, for better or worse, and impacted, countless lives.
It really makes you wonder about the forces driving these advancements. Is it purely about military necessity? Or are there other factors at play, like political ambition or even, maybe even just a desire to show off technological superiority? What do you think?
It's tough to say for sure. I think it's probably a combination of factors.
Yeah.
Throughout history, you see this recurring pattern. One nation develops a new weapon, and then its rivals, they scramble to create something even more powerful, and it just leads to this escalation of destructive capabilities.
It's like this deadly game of one-upmanship, but it's playing out on a global scale with incredibly high stakes. But beyond just the geopolitical implications, I think there's also the very real human cost to consider.
Oh, absolutely. You read those stories from the trenches, the accounts of soldiers facing these weapons, and it paints a very stark picture of the physical and psychological toll of warfare. The trauma, the suffering, it's all a reminder that technological progress, it doesn't always equate to moral progress.
So as we start wrapping up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you hope our listener will really take to heart?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's just crucial to understand that weapons technology is in a constant state of evolution.
Yeah.
What was considered cutting edge, maybe even just a few decades ago, might now be completely obsolete. And the pace of innovation, it's not slowing down, it's just going to keep accelerating.
Yeah, and it's almost dizzying to try and imagine what the weapons of the future might look like. And I think that brings us to a really crucial question. As these weapons become more and more powerful, more sophisticated, what are the ethical considerations? Where do we draw the line?
It's the question, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it's one that deserves serious consideration, and not just from, policymakers and military leaders, but from all of us. We need to be having these conversations, these thoughtful discussions about the implications of these advancements. What are the potential consequences, both intended and unintended?
And how do we ensure that these incredibly powerful weapons are never actually used?
Yeah.
It's a heavy topic to think about, but it's a conversation we can't afford to ignore.
Couldn't agree more. As we've seen in this deep dive, weapons technology has had, I mean, a profound impact on human history. And as technology continues to advance, I think it's more important than ever that we engage in these thoughtful, informed discussions about the role of these powerful tools in our world.
Well said. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive into the world of weapons technology.
It's been my pleasure.
And listener, we really encourage you to continue exploring these questions. The history of weapons technology is a complex and often unsettling story, but it's a story that has shaped our world in profound ways. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep asking those questions and keep exploring those deep dives that matter to you.